Hello, Hoyas. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with my companion, Gregory Schenden, Father Greg Schenden. Father Greg was ordained in 2008. We just missed each other by a few years. In Berkeley during the theology studies. I left there in 2003. I think you got there, what, in 2004, maybe, 5?
2005.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Then we also missed each other at Loyola Chicago.
At Loyola Chicago, that's right, where I taught. You were this leaving as I was coming.
Right.
Greg, you did your regency at the Jesuit High School here at Gonzaga Prep in DC.
Right.
After ordination, you came to Holy Trinity and was an associate pastor there before coming here. And you came to Georgetown in the campus ministry program in 2014. So right. You now finishing six years with us here.
Right. It goes quickly.
Great. Well, listen, when you first came to Georgetown, you were kind of the Jesuit Catholic chaplain working alongside so many other ordained clergy and campus ministers. But last year you were promoted, congratulations, to the director of campus ministry. Can you just tell us a little bit about this new role that you fill and what's the same about it? What's different in your engagement with students, staff, and faculty as now the director of campus ministry?
What's different? More meetings, Father Bosco, more meetings. But actually, that is, I mean, all kidding aside, that's really been a really, I mean, it's been actually a wonderful gift in many ways to be more involved administratively, and especially in so many, various endeavors involving our colleagues across the university, from student affairs to housing to, CAPS, to be involved in so many different facets in new ways, and in many ways to bring not that the voice of Ignatian Spirituality is not already out there, but to bring it uniquely as I do, which is something I think I do, in this new role, as I've done in different ways prior, as you had said, as, Roman Catholic chaplain prior to being director of campus ministry. Majority of my day-to-day ministry was directly with students, faculty, staff, more on the spiritual level. But it's really bringing, our Ignatian charism to a new realm in terms of the administrative aspects of the university.
Yeah, and I do like the way that you also, it's not just serving others outside of our department, but you really in some ways are helping to kind of shape and form in a very explicit way what our department is about at campus ministry. Right. And I was thinking about it, it's such a unique program here at Georgetown, with our engagement and our real commitment to interfaith accompaniment and dialogue, our sense of really working as a team across the faith traditions. Can you say anything about the uniqueness of this program? And I was wondering, you've been here now for like 6 years. What are one or two highlights over the last 6 years of just being part and parcel of the ministry team here at Georgetown?
One ties in directly with the uniqueness, I think, of our campus ministry. And one thing, and you've been present, is at the beginning of the academic year, during new student orientation, our students' first evening without families and friends, when everybody goes home, the first event they gather for is in McDonough, of course, for the Jesuit Values Panel. And that is always an incredible experience, because here we have all of campus ministry, Imam Hendi and Rabbi Rachel and Brahmachari and Reverend Grissom and all of us on this stage in front of the entire first year class, gathering on their own for the first time to listen to Jesuit values. And one of the just remarkable things is to hear each of our chaplains in campus ministry speak to our Jesuit values from the depth of their own traditions. So to hear, Imam talk about women and men for others, but that's the power of it. And that's something, I think it's something, and you used the word just a few moments ago, explicit. There's something explicit about how that is lived out in campus ministry here at Georgetown within all of our, various chaplaincies. That's always, that's really, really a high point. And also there's the friendship between everybody on that stage really shows as well. I mean, these are not just, folks that I work with, but these are their colleagues, obviously, but they're friends as well. And that's always a moment when I look at these years of being in campus ministry. The other moment I would have to say, as I was thinking about this, was it was a moment. It was late summer of 2018, and if you remember, in 2018, that was when the Philadelphia grand jury stuff broke. All the stuff was cracking open, and again, in terms of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. And right prior to new student orientation, and it was something we had planned well in advance, we had planned a retreat at the Calganini Center for our Catholic student leaders. And it was just a moment where everything seemed so dark, Mark, in the church. And 50 of our Catholic students returned to campus early, so as to attend this retreat for a couple of days, talking about for them what it is and what it means to be a Catholic leader, and because they all are. That was just in a moment that was pretty dark, I think, for many of us. That was just a real moment of incredible consolation and just real comfort in the midst of all that, at the hands of our students.
That's great. Yeah. No, our students are amazing. They're spiritually awoke. They're, as I like to say, wicked smart. And you just have to just call them into leadership, and they take it. So that's wonderful.
It's about empowerment, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole thing, about empowering them. And that's so much a part of what we are here at Georgetown as campus ministry.
Yeah, exactly. I feel really honored, to be with you. And of course, we have Father Jerry Hayes. It's very rare that I've said this to you before, that any department in a university has 3 Jesuits in it that really work well together. So,
right.
But one of the things I must admit is, I didn't really know you that well. I knew your name and stuff. But when I got here, I think the very first long conversation, I think it was outside. You were smoking, I think, in the backyard or something. And it started out with Flannery O'Connor, of course, right? But
okay, it's been how many minutes since we started? It's been 10 minutes, and that's when we mentioned Flannery.
But it quickly moved to poetry. And
Absolutely.
I was so amazed at, my gosh, the way that poetry kind of lives in your mind, in your heart, almost in your blood. And of course, we started talking about Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet. And really, you share your poetry on Facebook. You share poetry at liturgies. I just heard you on Sunday at Dahlgren on the live stream. Again, reciting poetry is a way to engage the people of God. What is it about poetry that makes it important to life for you or for everybody? And I guess I'm interested. You kind of share this poetics of the faith. What does that mean for you? How is Ignatian spirituality engaged in all that? That's a lot to give you, but
that is, and I'm going to make the definitive statement on all of that, Mark. No, I mean, just for starters, I think in terms, because I look at my love of poetry, and my love of poetry, I can't separate it out from my love of music, and I think that's in many ways how I came to love poetry. Is growing up and listening to a myriad of all sorts of different singers and songwriters. There used to be this show when I was in middle school and high school back in Detroit. There was a show on the radio every night at 10 p.m. This DJ by the name of The Electrifying Mojo. And it was this great whole lead in where it's like, okay, the mothership is coming in over the city of Detroit and it's landing. And what he really introduced me to was just this myriad of voices. He would be playing something German techno like Kraftwerk, and then he would play something by the B-52s. And he really was the one who introduced me in those early 80s years to the early rap and hip hop stuff. Africa Bambaataa and Grandmaster Flash, and even like Run DMC, which was so much, I mean, the language and the sound of language. And then when I really, and in high school, I studied poetry, and I would have to memorize, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. I thought poetry had to rhyme, or I just didn't get it. But then I really got to, it was in undergrad, and that was when I really started to fall in love with poetry, both in terms of sound and in terms of content. And it was my sophomore year at John Carroll University, and second semester, and I had this poetry course with, I still remember, Professor James Magner, and the dude looked like Walt Whitman, but just loved, I mean, he really did. But he loved poetry, and he was the one who first said, you know, you have to read poetry aloud. And he was the one who really introduced, I first read Gerard Manley Hopkins in his class. And I remember, you know, he would say, go home and read this aloud. And I was embarrassed to go back to my dorm room and read it in front of my roommates. So I would go, I worked at the radio station at John Carroll as a DJ, and we had a production studio. I'd go sit in the production studio by myself and read poetry aloud. And so much of it is just, you know, it's on the page, but when you read it, it comes alive and you hear it in a whole new way. But with a poet such as Hopkins, it's the sound, but it's the content as well. I mean, that's what makes Hopkins so brilliant, don't you think?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It needs to be spoken. It needs to be heard because he's in jamming sounds. He wants to kind of break up our normal pattern of speaking so that we're kind of shocked almost in moments of beauty or moments of elision or moments of collision, right? With words. Yeah. You know, of course, Hopkins is this great Jesuit artist of the late 19th century. His poetry, as you said, was part of high schools and university curriculums. I'm sure you taught it in high school at Gonzaga Prep. I certainly taught it at Regis. I teach it now in my classes here. And whether you're Catholic or not, everybody says Hopkins is one of those poems that you have to engage to understand poetry, and modern poetry especially. But, you know, he was a faithful son of Ignatius of Loyola, but so misunderstood by his Jesuit superiors.
Right.
Do you think a little bit about his life and why it was, do you think that he was just like always kind of like on the fringe in some ways of being understood?
Well, and that's a great question. And again, I'm not the greatest scholar on Hopkins himself, but I mean, I think, well, because, and it comes across in so much of his poetry too. When you look at a poem, you know, like, you know, the poem, you know, St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, about a Jesuit lay brother who all he did his entire life was simply serve as a porter at our college on the island of Majorca. This notion of, you know, because I tend to think as Jesuits, you know, we have the names, the big names that are up in lights, right? And I don't mean to sound, you know, heretical or anything, but, you know, Ignatius, of course, and, you know, Xavier, and, you know, Matteo Ricci and Rupe, but these little voices, and I think, you know, Hopkins always saw himself as one of those little voices.
Yeah.
Because as you pointed out, you know, he was not, you know, his superiors did not see this poetry thing as, I think, and maybe that's what it was. They didn't see it as something that was practical in terms of the mission of the Society of Jesus. Especially, don't you think, Mark, in that moment, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, the society had been restored at the beginning of the 19th century, and when we come back after the suppression, we come back in a very different way.
Yeah.
And we come back rather ultramontane, and we're going to be very, very, you know, obedient, you know, so as we don't get slapped down again and suppressed. And so, you know, the Society of Jesus takes on a difference in some ways, again, more ultramontane, very practical, you know, that type of form. And so something like being a poet as a Jesuit in that moment wasn't seen, well, no, that's not what you do. So we're going to send you to Dublin and we're going to, you know, burn you out by teaching, you know, I mean, and that's such a tough part of his life, you know, as he's
Latin and Greek, yeah. I mean, basically, Latin and Greek exams,
Oh.
you know, it's the last part of his life there at the Jesuit school there, yeah. You know, what's interesting about Hopkins is that it's not just that poetry was not the work maybe of the Society of Jesus or the work of the Jesuit, but his poetry was so different
Well, that's
Victorian poets in
yep.
England were around him. I mean, he's in some ways more modern than he
Oh,
is Victorian. I mean, think about the fact that he dies with none of his poetry really being known,
no.
but it's T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden and others who say, wait a minute, his poetry is what we are doing right now in 1925, 1935, 1945. And I do think there was something about those superiors must have been scratching their heads when they saw his poems, because they were so different than In Memoriam or a poem by Thomas Hardy or a poem by the Brownings. It was just, he's
Oh,
doing something fantastically new.
he was decades ahead of his time. But that's the whole thing. What he's doing also is, I mean, with sprung rhythm and all of that, is he's tapping in. I mean, he himself would state that, he's not inventing sprung rhythm, but he's taking it somewhere new. He's culling from, old folk songs, and he's culling from, Milton and Shakespeare. But that's what a great artist that is a genius does, is obviously building from what has been before, but does so in a very new and a very unique way, in a very singular, unique voice. And I think that's precisely it, he was decades ahead of his time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Even his best friends didn't really understand what he was doing, who were other poets.
Well, Bridges, I mean, for as much as Bridges ultimately gets him published posthumously, but
Right.
even some of the letters between them, Bridges is not getting them either.
Scratching his head, yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think one of the things that we've before we're going to go to some Hopkins poems soon, but one of the things that has happened, I think, in the last 50 to 60 years of education and academic research on what it means to have a Catholic imagination, is how Catholicism and how Christianity in general has produced kind of works of art, produced a culture that in somehow his poems are tangible ways for us to kind of sink into Ignatian spirituality, right? They're living beings in the sense that they're part of the artifacts of it. And one of the things when I teach the faculty, a seminar on all things Ignatian, I always invite you to come into with the 9 faculty, because you just, are you talking about Hopkins? Can I come in? So I was wondering, one of the things you said to our group is, you said that Hopkins is more like a hip hop artist than he is a Victorian poet.
Absolutely.
And can you explain a little bit about that? Because I think it's a fascinating. I mean, you had everybody's eyes just like, what? So what do you mean by that?
Gerard Manley Hopkins and Kendrick Lamar have a connection. Yes, they do, and they do. And I don't, I'm not trying to be, silly when I say that, because again, and you're bringing so many wonderful pieces into this, Mark. That whole notion of sprung rhythm. That notion of trying to, imitate the natural rhythm of natural speech, as again, I just said, going back to folk songs, that natural rhythm. And that's what Hopkins is doing. And that's what, when you listen to hip hop, that's the precise same thing that hip hop is doing. It's trying to reproduce natural rhythms in a natural, of natural speech. And it's kind of funny, and this is just an aside here though, but when we talk about high and low art, I don't know what that means, because we now consider poetry and Hopkins, that's high art. It's brilliant, but what about hip hop? And hip hop, because it does at its best that very same thing in terms of a device such as sprung rhythm, it's equally high art, and it's equally genius. But I think the connection too is, with all of this, it's also, you talked about Ignatian spirituality there, Mark, and I think whether explicitly with Hopkins or implicitly with secular artists that might implicitly be very spiritual, like somebody like Kendrick Lamar, it's all very Ignatian because it's so experiential, right?
Right.
I mean, Ignatian spirituality is experiential. writ large with the Catholic faith, it's incarnational, so it's rooted in this world, the challenges in and of this world, but it's experiential at the core, and it's incarnational,
Yeah, yeah.
and yeah.
Hopkins for me is, I once heard another poet, Catholic poet actually, from now retired from Boston College, Paul Mariani, once say that you can kind of divide Hopkins' poems into consolations and desolations.
Oh.
And it's a little bit maybe too neat because there's those nature poems, but those are always consoling things. I was wondering, Hopkins is this guy who's almost, he's Victorian in this way. He's alive with all the machinations of the world and the way that biology is working and the way that a bird flies and the way that, smoke rises. I mean, he seems to kind of capture in words the kind of almost descriptive kind of engagement that the Victorians had, that almost overwhelming sense of how does this work? How does that work? How does this work? How does that work? And I was wondering, is there of all of his poems, is there one that kind of moves you in nature, that one of his nature poems that you like?
Oh, of course. So I go to all my Hopkins here. Bring out the Hopkins now.
Hopkins, okay.
Well, and it was funny because last night I was thinking of, like, how on iTunes you have, like, with an artist profile, you'll have like kind of the greatest hits and then the deeper cuts and stuff like that. I'm going to start off with a greatest hits,
Okay.
because it's probably one of the first ones I remember reading back in undergrad. But it ties in, again, the natural world, but also our place in the natural world. Because, another facet of Hopkins is the whole notion of in stress, the thisness of everything,
Right.
And so with obvious choice, as Kingfishers Catch Fire really gets to that notion of the thisness of all of the created world, but also our role in that as well, as uniquely created in the image and likeness of God. So with that, Hopkins writes, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bells, bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being endures, each one dwells, selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. I mean, it's astounding, right?
It's my favorite of all time. I mean, I love Hopkins, but I go back to that. It is the most incarnational poem. It's the most faith-filled poem, and I love the fact that you, by the way, you've just read it beautifully. I mean, you made the poem come alive, especially how you raced through the first, part of it, which is exactly how I think Hopkins is like. Look at this. Look at kingfishers. Look at dragonflies. Look at tumbled wells. Look at stones. Look at strings. Look at a bell. Look at, I mean, he just look. This is all these things that are happening, that they're doing their essential thing that they do, their thisness. And then you pause beautifully. And then the poem changes, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, exactly. I mean, in that second half, which becomes our role, how do we fit into the thisness of all of creation, and it's, again.
And all the doings of creation.
Right, exactly. And that line, for what I do is me, for that I came. And all of creation says that, but how does this apply to us? And I think it's so powerful that of any way to lead us into humankind, the just man justices. It comes down to this notion of justice too. He's so Catholic there, he's so Jesuit there, that it's the just man justices, but it's all tied into, Christ at play in each of us. And just, again, content-wise, but again, and I did, that first part is very Victorian. You're kind of overstuffed. You feel like you're in Sherlock Holmes' apartments. But again, and it's just the sound, but the sound of it. And, it's just the sound, and you can sit and meditate with this poem forever. But the sound of it leads you into that desire to want to explore it further as to what he's saying. And that's really where, again, the experiential aspect, he's speaking experientially, but poetry then becomes experiential as we enter into it and engage it.
Yeah.
Hopkins wrote it, it's on a page, but then the third player in this is the one encountering and experiencing and entering into it. Hope that doesn't sound too lofty, but
no, but he really, and he invites us in by using the word, we're supposed to participate. I say more. The just man justice. That I's got to be me, right? I have to say more. That when I do justice, when I live the virtue of justice, I am making justice happen in the world. Right. That the thisness of it becomes a doing. And then, of course, I love the fact that Christ is the axis mundi, right? Because there's that wonderful line that Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit theologian, says that Christ is the way God sees humanity, and so he sees it through his Son, and Christ is the way we see the Father through the Son. So there is this idea of the seeing. So Christ plays in 10,000 places. He is in what God's eye he is, and I just think that's a fantastic. Can we find Christ in 10,000 places?
Right.
We should be able to. That our faith allows that. It's the vision that we're given, and this poem just beautifully kind of opens that up.
Well, and that's right, and that's where Hopkins again is so Jesuit, because it is that seeking and finding God in all things. Right?
Yeah.
That notion of it is in all of this.
Every single poem is an AMDG to the greater glory. I mean, it's just the greater glory. It's like the poem will push you into a moment when you sense glory. You sense things like that.
Wouldn't you say, Mark? I mean, all of his stuff, but wouldn't you say that Kingfishers? I mean, that really so beautifully kind of sums up Hopkins' worldview. I mean, of all his poems. I mean, all the rest. In the same way, the spiritual exercises come out of the principle and foundation. That's Ignatius's worldview. The rest comes out of that. In some ways, it seems for me, Kingfishers just gets to it, and all the rest plays out of that. The beautiful stuff as well as the dark stuff.
Yeah, we're going to get to the dark stuff in just a second, because I find those desolating poems really helpful, especially at times like we are going through right now in our world with COVID-19, with Black Lives Matter. I want to do one more kind of a nature poem that I think does the same, called Pied Beauty. And I like to say pied because it means not like a beautiful, it's something's a little off, right? When it's pied, there's some kind of smudge or something. And so it's a beauty, not of perfection, but the beauty of who we are. Anyway, Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles in all stipple upon trout that swim. Fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, flinches wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him.
Well, amen. I mean, that is, again, astounding.
And all of us in our lives, we're all counter, we're all original, we're all spare. And we both know, Greg, we're both strange, right? We're fickle, we're freckled, and yet what fathers forth, what comes through, what unites us, what makes us all kind of, is that we're all kind of these creatures of God, It's just fantastic.
Well, and that, I love, and there's such delight in this poem too, as hearing you read it too. And again, thank you for reading this. That, again, what you just said there, we're all spare and strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how. I love that aside of who knows how. you know, there's something incredibly playful about that, you know?
Right, right.
And
Please.
no, just, and also, you know, there's a poetic term for it, and it's escaping me right now. You may remember, but when he creates these new terms that are often hyphenated, you know, the father's fourth type of thing, he creates these new terms that work so perfectly. You know, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Fathers, my goodness.
Yes, right. And he kind of like catches up too, because we can almost expect a maternal image of mother's forth, like mothering, and it's a father. So we know that we're talking about this divine Trinity here. Yeah. So let's move to these other poems, because he's he wrote some tough, really harrowing poems. What I think was in what Ignatius of Loyola would call desolation, right? Time of prayerful desolation. But they're beautiful and profound. And again, I think they're even they're more of the moment we're all experiencing as we navigate COVID and we navigate the kind of systemic racism and all that stuff. But it's a very personal kind of poetry too, of desolation. Which of these do you resonate with? And could you read one and help us through to see how poetry can actually give words to our desolation, our grief, when we can't articulate it ourselves?
Right. And that's, again, you bring up such a great point there as well, Mark, is that, you know, poetry, you know, and song can put, I mean, and that's the brilliance of, you know, a poet, is they can put into words, and so powerfully, so beautifully, so much of what we necessarily, you know, we can't articulate ourselves. And sometimes sitting with a poem like that, it's like, yes, that's what I'm feeling, you know. And yes, I will read one of you know, the sonnets of, you know, one of the dark sonnets, as they're called, or sonnets of desolation. And this one's it's No Worst, in which Hopkins writes, "No worst there is none, pitched past pitch of grief, more pangs will, schooled at 4 pangs wilder ring. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? My cries heave, herds long, huddle in a main, a chief woe, world sorrow, on an age-old anvil wince and sing, then lull, then leave off. Fury had shrieked, no lingering, let me be fell, force, I must be brief. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. Hold them cheap, may who ne'er hung there. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, creep, wretch, under a comfort serves in a whirlwind. All life, death does end, and each day dies with sleep." Oh.
Yeah, it's got to be one of his hardest ones. We'll unpack that for our Hoyas here. Those. I mean, it's easy to see beauty in the kind of the piedness of life, or in a windhover. But can you unpack a little bit about what he's trying to say?
Well, you know, I think in so many ways. I mean, I think all of these, you know, these dark sonnets or sonnets of desolation, really, at least I think, are very. They're like Job in the Hebrew Scripture.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, whatever that darkness may be, that for Job, it was, you know, it was everything, you know, being taken away, you know, his family dying and his livestock, and he's ill and living on a dung heap. And for Hopkins, you know, it was that desolation. Was he in Dublin at the time when he wrote this? I
don't think so. I think he was still, I think he's just getting there. Well, some of them were written before he got there, and the rest were written in Dublin.
Right.
I'm just not sure where this one falls, but yeah.
But it was, I mean, again, it's that Jobian moment for him, you know, in his own life, and he had a number of those moments. And again, as you brought up, I mean, what does this speak to us now? You know, in the midst of, you know, the pandemic of COVID and the pandemic of racism and racial injustice. You know, it is, but it's that cry. You know, comforter, where is your comforting? And he brings, I mean, Ignatius Hopkins, of course, had a great devotion. Mary comes through in May Magnificat, but this is Mary, Mother of us. Where is your relief?
Right.
It's everything is so dark. But what I appreciate there, and that's why I go back to the book of Job, and that in the midst of this desolation, it's this, it's not, I'm done with you, God. It's not, I'm done with you, Mary. It's, where are you in this?
Right.
And I want an answer.
Right.
I want an answer. And that's, again, if we go back, Mark, to seeking and finding God in all things, where are you in all of this?
Right. Right.
And I think that's so much of what comes out in that poem is, where are you in this?
Yeah.
Oh, it's stark, but it's not without a sense of hope, in a sense.
Well, there's always there. It's always in those last couple lines, usually, when you sense that he's coming back to himself after having done what Job does, and woe is me, and it kind of comes back to, yet I sense the fact that I'm small and I'm not the center of the universe. I'm not the master of everything, and I must be more receptive to a world that I can't control. I want to read another one that I think is really pertinent to the moment, I guess. Thou art indeed just, Lord, which I love.
Oh.
With that great joke, right? Like, but it's like, if this is how you're just with your friends, wasn't it St. Teresa, I think, of Avila, says, if this is how you treat your friends, Lord, wow, no reason you have a lot of enemies,
No wonder you have so few friends. That's exactly it.
Right.
Yep.
But it's, thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat thwart me? Oh, the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend, sir, life upon thy cause. See, banks and brakes now, leaved how thick, laced they are again with fretty cheverel. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build. No, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. It's just, it's the, why do people who seem to be terrible people, why do people who are selfish, why are people who are cruel, why do they seem to kind of keep on engaging in more power and more stature in our world? And it's the question of how do we do justice? How does the just man just when we have a world like this? It's just a beautiful poem.
Oh, right. Well, no, it's the older son and the prodigal son story. It's him saying, he did everything wrong, yet gets the reward. What about me? And it's that. But again, as you said earlier, Mark, there's always that note, especially that final line in the midst of all this. Why? Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. And there's that, the nature imagery, but also that very personal, experiential crying out to God. It's all connected.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful way to end. Hopkins, in some ways, gave credibility in a secular world of where poetry and religion really kind of were polarized. That you couldn't really be a serious religious poet in the 20th century. But Hopkins was a way back into that, right? And so, of course, T.S. Eliot kind of baptizes him as a modern poet. W.H. Auden. But there are other poets today, I think, that are also kind of living and get their own sense of standing because Hopkins opened up a way for them to use language to talk about that. Who are some of the poets that you read that seem to kind of be part of that genealogy of Hopkins?
Well, going back kind of to that singular moment when you talked about, Hopkins being discovered by Eliot and by Auden, in the, those early decades of the 20th century, in that category, This may sound like an odd reach. Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, okay.
Can I read a little bit from one of his poems?
Sure.
Because he has his one poem, "The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower." It's all about kind of, creation, birth, death, but it kind of reminds me in some ways of Hopkins. And I think it's Thomas's Welsh background, and some of his stuff does have those very, like Hopkins, nature's beauty type of stuff. But Thomas writes, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. That blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. And I am dumb to tell the crooked rose, my youth is bent by the same wintry fever." And he goes on in that very similar language through the course of the whole poem, in that kind of very Hopkins, natural world, and our role, how can we see ourselves as somehow outside of the natural world?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I can see that, and certainly there's something about Hopkins that he loves the Welsh language, right? He loves any language that is Anglo-Saxon guttural, that kind of uses sounds that resonate within the as opposed to those kind of sibilant things. He just loves those clashing sounds, and
Right.
Welsh has that kind of sense too. So I can see a little bit of affinity there as well. Yeah. There's so many poets that we can talk about. I was thinking about two women to kind of bring it maybe into the 20th, 21st century, Denise Levertov and Mary Karr. We're both big fans of Mary Karr. She's really more, I think, known as a memoirist, right? She wrote The Liars Club, Cherry and Lit, but Lit is her favorite, her big success, in the sense that she is bringing together her conversion experience, and part of that conversion experience was about her sobriety and the love of her son. And of course, her poetry changes from really dark and difficult poetry to a poetry that just it's more lucid. I don't know how else to say it. There's a lucidity.
Great way of putting it. Yep.
And Mary, of course, is a convert to Roman Catholicism. During this time, she tells us that story. And so two of her books, Sinner's Welcome was kind of a new way of poetry. Could we hear somebody who's still working, still writing poetry, still teaching the art of memoir? Is there a poem from her? This is a big shout out for you, Mary. Sinner's Welcome.
Yeah, exactly. Which this is the volume. This was the volume because I had read Lit, which was wonderful, and looked at some of her earlier stuff, and again, it was dark and I did not like it.
Yeah.
But then it was this volume that really got me into her stuff. And the first poem that I really fell in love with from this volume is about her conversion, and it's called Disgraceland. Did you want me to read it?
Yeah, but go ahead.
So she writes this. It's beautiful. She says, "Before my first communion at 40, I clung to doubt as Satan spider-like stalked the orb of dark surrounding Eden for a wormhole into paradise. God had first formed me in the womb, small as a bite of burger. Once my lungs were done, he sailed a soul like a lit arrow to inflame me. Maybe that piercing made me howl at birth, or the masked creatures whose scalpel cut a lightning bolt to free me. I was hoisted by the heels and swatted, fed, and hauled through rooms. Time-lapse photos show my fingers grew past crayon outlines. My feet came to fill spike heels. Eventually, I lurched out to kiss the wrong mouths, get stewed, and sulk around. Christ always stood to one side with a glass of water. I swatted the sap away. When my thirst got great enough to ask, a stream welled up inside. Some jade wave buoyed me forward, and I found myself upright in the instant, with the garden inside my own ribs aflourish. There the arbor leaves. The vines push out plump grapes. You are loved, someone said. Take that and eat it.
Yeah, it's by far one of her great poems of, and I just love that idea that I'm formed in the womb small as a bite of burger.
Burger. It's an updated version of Psalm 139, right? Right there, but that image of a bite of burger. It's so tactile. It's so human, and just it's perfect.
And getting at the very end of it, you are loved, so take that and eat it.
Isn't that great?
She accomplishes a lot in that. The other one I really love is Sinner's Welcome, the poem of the title of this collection. And again, all of these poems are about her trying to discover her own voice now as a person of faith, and this Christ that lives within her, this Christ that's been with her, but she's only acknowledging late in her life or later in her life. But it's called Sinner's Welcome, and of course, it's an Ignatian poem, I think. I opened up my shirt to show this man the flaming heart he lit in me, and I was scooped up like a lamb and carried to the dim warm. I, who should have been kneeling, was knelt to by one whose face should be emblazoned on every coin and diadem. No bare-chested boy, but Ulysses with arms thick from the hard-hulled ropes. He'd sailed past then clay gods and the singing girls who might have made that the world could arrive at me with him in it. After so much longing, impossible. He enters me and joy sprouts from us a split sea. That's a great poem. I'm getting a little bit of feedback when I speak, so we should have you speak some more. So what about Levertov? Do you have any poems by Levertov? Denise Levertov, another person who is a kind of a nature poet, big into social justice, and really becomes a Roman Catholic, converts at Stanford because she finds herself always on protest lines, picketing with the Americans or the nuns, all the become a community for her.
Right. There's that connection. Again, she finds that connection. Again, not seeking and finding God in all things, and that facet of it that I think Levertov, and I do have Levertov here too. I've got these stacks of books that I want to touch upon. There we go. The whole justice component into it, and that is so core to our understanding, and it is in some ways very, very Jesuit and Ignatian. That sense of justice being core to what it is to be, to be a follower of the gospel and a follower of Christ. Exactly.
Yeah. Is there something by? I mean, I know that Father Howard Gray loved the poem Annunciation, which is a little bit long. We maybe not go, but I know he loved it because when I took over this position in this office, he had that on the wall. The great poem of Annunciation.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
He had that on the wall. Yep.
Yeah. So, but one of the things that a poem that I've been reading almost daily is called "Making Peace." I think you've heard of this poem, right?
Yes.
It's the poet trying to say, how do our words help create peace, right? Here's a woman who she was a protester. She protested, and she got a lot of flack from other poets saying, you're doing too much of this social justice work. It's lessening your poetic inspiration. And she was like, no, poetry needs to be at a rally. Poetry needs to be as we protest nuclear proliferation, as we protest racism, as we protest sexism. So, and she was very much a feminist, wasn't she? So in that regard. Well, I'm going to read Making Peace, and then we're going to maybe go. We have maybe a what question or two, okay?
Okay.
Making Peace. A voice from the dark called out, the poets must give us imagination of peace to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war, but peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself. Can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making. grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid. A feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. A line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence our lives are making, revoked its reaffirmation of profit and power, questioned our needs, allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum, peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war, might pulse then stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living one of its words, each word a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal. Wow, that's beautiful, huh? I think that's the poem of the moment.
Well, that's, you know, the imagination of peace to oust, and the way she talks about an energy field more intense than war. I mean, this is, again, let's go for a moment, Mark, back to philosophy studies and Plato's Republic. And remember, is it book 10? I can't remember, but in the Republic, you know, Plato writes about, you know, beware the poets.
Yeah,
because
right.
what they will do is they can sway both not just thought, but emotion. And once you do that, you can change a civilization. And, you know, the Republic, that's dangerous to be able to do that. And there is power. There is power to everything we've been talking about.
Yeah. You know, it kind of sums up, there's a question, if Kelly, I'm going to go ahead and read it if that's okay. There's a question from one of our attendees, and I think it speaks to kind of where we are now in our conversation, I see. It says, this is obviously a time of great challenge to us in this country, confronting our racist past and present, which is on the one hand hope-inspiring, they can also be dark and desolate, especially as an alum of color. Which poems or poets bring you consolation in times of darkness?
Well, I think Hopkins, I think right there, Levertov, you know, I think a poem like that. I think, you know, we were talking, you had asked me a few days ago, Mark, you know, a poem that currently is resonating with you.
Yeah.
This may sound like an odd choice, but let me read it to you. And I think this gets to our viewers' question in terms of what brings you consolation. It's a poem called The Laughing Hearts from Charles Bukowski. And normally when you think Bukowski, you think all the depraved stuff of Los Angeles and all of that. But listen to this, and this is our moment. He writes this: your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dark submission. Beyond the watch, there are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Beyond the watch, the gods will offer you chances. Know them. Take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous. The gods wait to delight in you.
Wow. You have to share that with everybody, and certainly share that poem with me. I'm not familiar with it. What a great poem. Wow.
Isn't that, I mean, it speaks, I think in many ways it speaks to right where we're at.
You know, you also love other poets, though, that I, you know, certainly we have the poetry here at Georgetown of Carolyn Forche, this great a poet, really a poet of justice, a poet whose poetry really brings alive the dehumanization of peoples, especially of Central and South America. But you also, yesterday in your homily, you mentioned a poet. Who is that? I think it's really fascinating to me because I never knew she was a poet. I mean,
Patti Smith. So the singer-songwriter Patti Smith. And again, when I was a kid and being, you know, rebellious and into punk and wanted to be subversive and all of that, you know, her one song, Gloria, it starts out with the line, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. And I was like, as a teenager, I'm like, ooh, that's really subversive. She's incredibly spiritual and incredibly religious. But on Sundays, at Sunday's homily, it was, of course, the solemnity of the Most Holy Trinity. And there's a wonderful line in her most, this seems like I'm go out and buy it now. No, but this is her third memoir, Year of the Monkey, and it's probably the most, it's a dream fugue in many ways, and you don't know what is real and what is not, but somehow it's all speaking to truth. And she writes this one line, and I love this, and I use this again at the homily on Sunday. She said, "There's no hierarchy. That's the miracle of a triangle. No top, no bottom, no taking sides. Take away the tags of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and replace each with love." See what I mean? Love, love, love. Equal weight encompassing the whole of our so-called spiritual existence.
Yeah, it's powerful. That was again, it was the first time I'd ever thought of her as a poet. I mean, certainly as a singer and a songwriter, but amazing. I think one of the things that I wanted to have, this conversation with you, Greg, is you've been here now at Georgetown for these many years. You share poetry with students. You share your prayer life with students, and I do think that for many people, especially those who are struggling because they maybe are not deeply inside a tradition, or they're maybe kind of walking kind of at some objective distance from it because of their own pain or their own struggles within that tradition, poetry seems to be a kind of a way to kind of get to the space of prayerfulness, right? And I just want, maybe as we signing off here, we're just ending this hour. Can you talk about how you think poetry is like prayer? Going back to the poetics of faith again, what is it about poetry that speaks to us? And we can all do poetry, right? We can all get it. Sometimes people think, oh, you have to be, you have to have this. No, poetry's for everybody.
It's not the high art, low art thing. It is, exactly. And poetry is, there's a great line from the singer-songwriter, and I would say poets, Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie said, music, and I would put poetry in that, but he says music has to be more than just good. It's got to be good for something. And music, poetry, it's got to be more than just good. Yes, Hopkins, brilliant, sounds fantastic, but somehow this is tapping into the human condition as placed in the larger framework of faith. However we understand faith, from a variety of different facets, but it's putting ourselves in position and in relationship with something greater than ourselves. I mean, that's, you quoted Ronner a little while ago, and when he talked about art, he said, arts, and he said even secular arts, it can be religious in the sense that if it invites the viewer, the listener, deeper into an experience of the transcendent.
Yeah.
And I think that's whether it is explicitly religious poetry or not, if it's Patti Smith or if it's Lou Reed, or if it's Kendrick Lamar, if it's somehow talking and speaking truth to the human condition in hope, in the spirit of hope of something greater, that light. I think that's what poetry, that's the power of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, listen, Father Greg Schenden, you bring a poetry to life here at Georgetown, so I really appreciate all your work you do with our students especially, but our faculty and staff. And I thank you for this conversation. It was a lot of fun. It's always fun to talk poetry.
This is a blast, Mark. This is a blast. I mean, it really was. And it was like, okay, let's make a series out of this little poetry salon here. So thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity. And thanks to our Hoyas for listening to something that Mark and I both love so much. So thank you.
Join us in a couple of weeks. We're going to do one more of these, I think, at least one more. It's a Jesuit conversation with Father Jerry Hayes, our Director of Ignatian Programs, and we're going to speak and talk about how does Ignatian spirituality, how can it be a kind of a way for us to live through not only COVID-19, but really the struggle of the pandemic of racism. And so we're just going to talk about the prayerful kinds of ways in which Ignatius and the spiritual tradition can ground us in this moment. So again, thanks very much, Greg. Thanks, Alumni Association. Thank you, Hoyas. We'll see you next time.
Peace.